Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar organized by Novalis Publishers. I am Father Édouard Shatov, Assumptionist priest and author of the book A Russian Pilgrim in the 21st Century. I'm delighted to have you with us today for this webinar entitled Lives That Shapes a Nations, celebrating the Irish story in Canada. Today, we will have the opportunity to hear a discussion between 50 Irish Lives in Canada authors, Eamonn McKee and Mark McGowan. Dr. Mark McGowan, a professor emeritus of history and Celtic studies at St. Michael's College in the University of Toronto. From 2002 to 2011 and from 2020 to 2022, he served as principal and president of the University of St. Michael's College. He is a specialist in the history of the Catholic Church in Canada, transatlantic migration, religion and ethnicity, particularly the Irish, and the Great Irish Famine. He has written over a dozen books and countless articles. His most recent book, Finding Molly Johnson, Irish Famine Orphans in Canada, published in 2024, was recently shortlisted for the best scholarly book in Canada in English by the Canadian Historical Association. He has served as president of the Canadian Catholic Historical Association and the Canadian Society of Church History. In 2025, he was elected to the Royal Society of Canada. A graduate of University College Dublin, Dr. Eamonn McKee was awarded a PhD by the National University of Ireland in 1987. He joined the Department of Foreign Affairs in 1986 and spent 20 years on the Northern Ireland peace process, including as a member of the Good Friday Agreement talks team. After posting at the embassy in Washington and Consulate General New York, he served as ambassador to the Republic of Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Israel, and Canada, Jamaica, the Bahamas, and Antigua and Barbuda. Posts at headquarters included United Nations Director, Director of Humanitarian Relief, Director of the Conflict Resolution Unit, and Director of Trade. Throughout his career, he continued to blog and write on history. He retired from the department in June 2025. He currently serves as co-convener of the Global Irish Famine Way. Welcome, Eamonn. Welcome, Mark. A Q&A period will follow the discussion. To help make this segment run smoothly, I encourage you to type your questions using the Q&A tab located at the bottom of your screen. You may submit them at any time as they come to mind, and I will gather them for the designated period. I would also like to inform you that Novalis Publishing Group is offering 50 Irish Lives in Canada at a special discount for the participant of this webinar for a limited time. My colleague will share the promotional code at the end of the webinar. You will be able to use it on our website or by calling our customer service. Finally, please note that this webinar is being recorded. It will be available to watch and share in a few days. So now we will start our conversation. Again, thank you very much, Eamonn and Mark, to respond to this request or invitation to join this webinar about Irish history in Canada and about around this book that was published, 50 Irish Lives in Canada. So let us just start this conversation around one simple question. Eamonn, Mark, why did you think that this project is important, particularly at this time? Eamonn McKee coordinated the project and was also at the origin of this, but he was not alone in the beginning, and the idea generated in the conversation, as I understood from the book, between you, Eamonn, and Mark. So, would you explain to us why did you think, both of you, that it is an important project?
I think it's because it's an unknown story about the Irish. If you think about the Irish as immigrants, it's about the United States. The Irish have been coming to Canada for 300 years, and it's basically unknown in Ireland. And when I got to Ottawa, I discovered like heard these stories about Mother McGinty's pub, but really the number of name places around Ottawa and the Ottawa Valley were so Irish. And I began to pull on this story. And Mark introduced me to Michael McBain, a local historian. We had a fantastic meeting. And out of that, then we said, there's some way we must tell this story. And then the Royal Irish Academy published a book called Irish Lives in America. And I said, we need one of these. And so I called Mark, and Mark said, great idea. And then within, I don't know, within a week, we had a consortium of writers, academics, right across America. And they began to pick their favorite kind of profiles for this. We said, we can tell this story because 300 years is an awful long time. And there's so much going on in terms of the North Atlantic between Ireland, colonization, Canada, colonization, its move to Confederation. The only way we could actually get this into one publicly available but easily read book was to say, let's do it like the RIA model. 50 profiles, 1,000 words, which is pretty condensed actually. But it's a great, and I think Mark and our writers will agree, it's a great discipline. But there were a couple of things we wanted to do at the beginning, and Mark was very insistent on this. This is not just about famous people. They're in there, but it's also about quote unquote ordinary people. And we'd always make the point there are no ordinary lives when you're an immigrant. I mean, if you're traveling across the North Atlantic 100 years ago or 200 years ago, 300 years ago, this is a huge adventure. These are incredibly heroic people. The other point is we were really trying to find women because women have been written out of the historical record. And even when they achieved things, they were anonymized. So finding women was a big part of it. I think Mark can correct me on this, but we're up around 30, 25, 30% of the entries are women, but we did have to look hard for them. And we did try to balance it across all of the provinces, you know. But it developed an energy of its own. It became a huge labor of love. The final point I'd probably make is that, you know, when you say how did you pick them? I think we had basic ideas about balance, about the gender balance, about the balance between Catholics and Protestants as well. But it kind of emerged naturally from our kind of a first cut. I should also say, actually, one of the other decisions we made was that they had to be born in Ireland and they had to be dead as candidates for the book. Born in Ireland, because if you didn't limit it to those born in Ireland, the tsunami just opened because there are so many Irish Canadians. And I think, in a way, the value of the book is that you can read the 50 lives and make up your own mind about what was going on, what was the process here, what were the contributions and the ones that appeal the most to you personally, you know.
So, Mark, when Eamon called you or wrote to you, as he said, so how did you feel and why did you think it was an important thing to write this book?
Okay, well, first of all, you don't get a call from an ambassador every day of the week, and so you do take note. But Eamon and I had already had a working relationship as soon as he arrived, and he arrived in the middle of COVID, and I had reached out to him because at St. Mike's U of T, we have a long-standing Celtic Studies program and an even longer-standing relationship with the Irish ambassador, the Irish government, and I wanted to make sure that the pandemic didn't sideline that in any way. So he and I already had worked with each other online. But when this came up, I mean, I'm a social historian, and you had said, I write religious history, but I also write the history of immigration, and that's my inherent want to flesh out the stories of average, ordinary people, either at worship or in their daily lives in so many other ways. And so, as a social historian, oftentimes, immigrant groups get marginalized in the popular literature. They become part of the scenery, so to speak. I want to flesh out those lives as they are lived because I think they're important, not just to Irish immigrants, but in this case to immigrants in general. And let's face it, in Canada, we're all immigrants except the Indigenous peoples, and that's an interesting relationship that we had to address in this book as well, and that we can talk about later. But in this particular case, as a social historian, I was struck by the opportunity now with Eamonn's support and with the collaboration of scholars that I knew who wanted to tell these stories that generally don't get told, to put them in a place where not just scholars would enjoy and be interested in the stories, but that all readers could take up a book with 1,000 word limit on each biography and pick it up, read a couple of biographies and say, oh, that was very interesting. I had no idea. And then put it down and pick it up again. So it's not one of those, how should we say, heavily jargon-laden academic books that would drive an audience away. I would like, to say that any member of my family could pick up this book, and they have. I have a granddaughter who has a copy, and my mother-in-law has a copy, and she's going to be 97. And to take that range of readers and try to create stories that are important, that are interesting, and that they cross all occupations, classes, genders, and of course in Canada, regions from Newfoundland right through to British Columbia.
You
It's
know,
also to add
yeah.
on that, though, that we have thematic essays in there as well. So I've done an introduction which gives an historical view. Mark has done a survey as well of the settlement patterns and the impact as well. So we do give the individual profiles a kind of a broader context. And you can see it from the front cover. The emblem perfectly captures this because we've got that interaction between the feather representing the indigenous, the shamrock, obviously Irish, and the maple leaf. And so it's a very complex story in terms of how all of these different facets of the Irish and Canada interact.
Let me make a little bit of joke following what Mark was saying. You never take for granted the call from the ambassador or the president of the university. So even in this webinar, it is an interesting conversation. But what also interesting in this book that you covered a quite large period of history is from 1661 to 2017. So it's a big period. And also you look at the different stories in the complex story of interaction in one country, in one, I would say, identity that is built around one country. And that's a very tricky question because particularly at this time that many of us preoccupied by the question of nation, of identity, of immigration. And Mark, you're the specialist, which is, studying the immigration, and you, Eamonn, was the ambassador. It means you was dealing with this at everyday level. So how do you see important elements through this Irish presence in Canada?
I think, but see, identity changes all the time. I mean,
Yeah.
this is one of the things you have to be careful about, that we have a sense of Irish nationhood. We have a sense of the nation state. But what we're looking at over these 300 years is evolutions of these polities, both in
Hmm.
Ireland, The British Empire itself is changing. The constitutional question as it applies to Canada. These are constantly changing issues over the generations. I
Hmm.
mean, and again, you're right. There is a big span. In fact, even in my introduction, I go back as far as the Roman Empire to show the Western colonization, because you have to understand the reason why are Irish people going across the North Atlantic from this period, like our first character
Hmm.
that we know of, Tygo Brennan in 1661. They're going because they're responding to or fleeing from an evolving colonization process in Ireland itself. And what's really fascinating about many of these lives is that the Irish in Canada are, some of them are colonized in Ireland and go to Canada to
Hmm.
be settlers, to be colonizers. Others in Ireland, particularly in the late 18th century, are colonizers of Ireland, or at least their forebears was, and they're also going as colonizers. So there's a fascinating kind of interplay, and it's really about the dynamics of empire, the dynamics of settlement. Some of the most famous early Irish who were in Canada, Guy Carleton, John Caldwell, Thomas Carleton, Richard Buckley. These are high-ranking colonial officials within Canada. They're fighting the French first, then they're fighting the invading American Revolutionary Army,
Hmm.
and then they're governing what is then British North America. And that's really the first significant wave. After that, you've got fishermen in Newfoundland, well, probably they were there
Hmm.
from maybe the late 1500s, as early as that. Then you've got Protestants who are leaving basically after 1800, which is when Ireland loses its parliament, and there was a rising in Ireland in 1798. Then you're followed by Catholics who come after the 1815 Napoleonic Wars end, and there's the economic recession in Ireland. So it really is a very complicated dynamic that's going on. And it could only really, and we say this, you can only really understand this as transatlantic colonialism. This is not, if you just say it's immigration, you're missing the kind of the engine. What's
Hmm.
driving this process across the Atlantic?
It's very interesting, Eamonn, and it means also that you underline the identity is never like fixed or static at any point of history. Is always evolving. It's always making this difference or evolution through conversation. Mark, and what are the elements that are important to like keep a look at or to take care of during this evolution of, let's say, identity, national identity, or different national identities that come together?
Yeah, and I would argue, and I've argued this throughout my academic life, is that when you look at a group like the Irish in Canada, you're really dealing with a community of distinctive communities right across the country, and it depends on the timing in which they came and the places in Ireland from which they came. If they came from the province of Ulster in the north, differed from, let's say, Kerry and Limerick in the extreme southwest, or where they came, which colony they came to, or which charter group in Canada, okay, whether it be Indigenous peoples, French or English, were the host society as they arrived. This is a complicated mix, so that the Irish communities that evolved, let's say, in Newfoundland, and it's about 40% of the population of the province of Newfoundland, really come from one specific area in Ireland, the southeast. So Waterford, Wexford, South Kilkenny, East Cork, South Tipperary, and they bring with them an accent and customs and folklore and traditions that are quite distinctive to that part of Ireland. And if when you go to St. John's, for example, today, and Eamon did, and I remember his comments back to me was, "Oh, I think I was walking down the streets of Waterford City, hearing these accents." Whereas the Irish in Montreal evolved differently as a double minority. Most of the Irish who decide to stay in Montreal in the early and mid 19th century are Roman Catholic. Now, there are some Protestants, but they're largely Roman Catholic. And here they've come to a province, particularly before 1829, where They have the freedom to practice their religion in public, engage in religious processions. They see priests and nuns walking the street with impunity. This is something that really is quite different from their home places in Ireland, and that they can vote and that they can be elected to the local assembly. They have rights in Quebec that they don't have elsewhere because of the Quebec Act of 1774. And then you begin to think, how do they retain their Irish identity? Because amongst their linguistic group, English, they are a minority because they're Catholic and not Protestant. And in their religious group, which is the vast majority of Catholics in Montreal, they're a linguistic minority. But some of them, do become quite fluent in French over time. In fact, one of our orphan children, Daniel Tighe from County Roscommon, his name is spelled Tighe, but when he inherits the farm from the famille Coulombe in Lotbinière, he becomes Daniel Tighe, Tye. And his family become francophones and Québécois, and to the extent where his great-grandson, when he returned to Ireland in 2013 for the gathering, Richard Tighe, who still held the farm in Lotbinière, couldn't speak a word of English, and his Thai relatives in County Roscommon from so many generations back couldn't speak a word of French, but they were all farmers and they could talk agriculture quite well. So you have this really complicated picture of a community of communities depending on all of these factors over time, and then what class they came from in Ireland. And Eamonn's pointed out that some of the initial Irish migrants that are in the book here were colonial masters. They were part of a Protestant ascendancy in Ireland, and they become colonial administrators here in Canada. And then you have, of course, this vast group of average, ordinary Irish people who try to make lives either in agriculture, in the industrial heartlands, or work their way up. Someone like John Egan, for example, who's prominent in the book, who from County Galway emerges as a lumber baron in the Ottawa Valley, and a parliamentarian try to soothe relations between Anglophones and Francophones, Catholics and Protestants. So it's a beautifully complicated story. That's all I can say. Complication doesn't have to be, how should we say, a negative.
Ugly. Ugly, yes.
It's
It
and
shouldn't be ugly.
it can be ugly, but I think what we have here is a great beauty in the way in which this people from that very small island do so many different things within so many different Canadian contexts because it's a big country with so many regional differences.
Hmm.
What is very impressive in your work and in this book, and I think what I had an impression that you show this beautiful complexity, or even, if I may say, the complexity of beauty at some point, that you touched upon different people from different social backgrounds, from different national backgrounds, but all of them are like interwoven in the one history, in one story, in the different ways. So now, because time is flying, I will ask you, would you like to share with us maybe two stories that particularly important for you, Eamonn McKee and you, Mark McGowan, in this book? One about one man and one about one woman, because it is also true that in your reflection, men and women of different backgrounds, and also with what particular insight of the First Nations people or the like interactions with the First Nations. So, what would you say? What was your, I would not say favorite people or favorite characters, because that would be some kind of presumption, but two people who really touched you more than others?
Mother Barnes, I think, the Witch of Plum Hollow. She leaves Ireland because she was forced into, or she was being betrothed to an older man. She leaves with her boyfriend. She comes. They're in North America. They're in the United States, but Mother Barnes ends up with a large family. Her husband deserts her. She takes on a lot of other children. She's living south of Ottawa, and in a tiny, tiny cottage. And to make extra money to kind of hold the family together and support everybody, she becomes a fortune teller. And she charges 25 cents. And she's upstairs in this absolutely tiny cottage, tiny little woman, very blue piercing eyes, wears black. And she became absolutely famous in the region for telling fortunes. But of course, there's no magic in this. What she's doing is she's using her life experience to solve problems between boyfriends and girlfriends. She's using her network of relations to find out who stole whose cattle or whose wallet. And she's applying her wisdom to solving problems. She never changes her rates, by the way. It's always 25 cent. Becomes hugely famous, essentially as an advisor. But why is she so important in this period in the late 1850s, early 1860s? Is because you have a wave of Irish coming in to this new land, and she's a guide to them as well. But she's a great example of a woman who is asserting her economic agency within this kind of almost frontier environment, you know. And at the end, she was interviewed by a journalist, and she said, "I'm a bit of a fraud. I'm a bit of a fraud," because she was dubbed eventually the Witch of Plum Hollow. But Mother Barnes is just this fantastic survivor, and knit together a society of disparate elements and new arrivals and all of that kind of thing. I think also the other one is the Ahern family. You know, the father comes in with the mother Nora, and he's a blacksmith, and he's in what is Bytown, this rough lumber town. Their son Tom Ahern becomes fascinated by electricity. He becomes the Edison of Canada. He invents the electric oven. He's on the commission planning the new town. When he's born in 1855, Bytown becomes Ottawa. He becomes an advisor to the Prime Minister. He sets up the electric tram system in Ottawa, changes the city completely. His son is a war hero and senator, and then his granddaughter becomes the consort to the first Canadian Governor General and attends the inauguration of Queen Elizabeth II. And I think it's just that the Aherns are really this fantastic family that within a matter of 3 or 4 generations, they go from being a blacksmith to being the chatelaine of the Governor General, Lilias Ahern. It's just an amazing story that could only have been accomplished in Canada. But it's also about the coming of a kind of a Catholic family as well, because I think it's one of the things we do touch on here is that there was anti-Catholic, anti-Irish feeling in Canada for most of its history. And that's why I think the number of Irish in Canada is probably an undercount. So you have a lot of the Irish they'll take out the O or the Mac, or they'll change the spelling of their name to integrate into what is, of course, predominantly, certainly in Ontario, a loyal Protestant political entity, you know, as part of the British Empire. So, for example, your most famous soldier in the First World War, Arthur Curry, you know, his grandfather spelled the name Corrigan, and it evolved from Corrigan to Curry in two different spellings, and that's a good example. So I think the Irish influence, even the Irish presence in Canada, is a vast undercount. But yeah, I think between Mother Barnes and the Aherns, they were ones that I was particularly taken with.
You know, when you talk about Mother Barnes, I could not help myself but to think about like the invention of the social worker
Yeah, yeah, it's a
profession,
good point.
because
Yeah,
she did exactly this, advising people, making the relationship, and this is maybe what we can take for today from this life, how we can be present to others. And you, Mark, what are your two, I would say, favorite people, if I don't like this word favorite, but one who really made an input in your heart?
Okay, so I mean, this is very difficult, Edward, because I
Yeah,
mean, there's so many interesting stories, but I'm going to choose one from the 19th century and choose one
yeah.
from the 20th century. From the 19th century, it would be Ellen Dease. Now, Ellen Dease became Mother Teresa Dease. She was from Kildare. Her family had been engaged in the British military as physicians, but she joined the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, or the Loreto Sisters, in Dublin at Rathfarnham at their mother house. In 1847, in the midst of the famine, Bishop Michael Power of Toronto wanted a religious order to essentially found schools for women and then young boys and girls in his diocese. And he actually went to Rathfarnham in the midst of the famine and got five sisters to come out to Canada. They arrive in Toronto in September of 1847, the five of them. They had gone via New York, and the first thing they had to do, they knocked on the Episcopal residence door and said they had to change their clothing because they had been in civilian clothing. And Teresa Dease was the youngest. Within a month, Bishop Power was dead of typhus. And these women were now on their own to establish a school which had been their commission. Several of the sisters die in the process, and Teresa Dease, this young woman, now becomes the head of the Loretto sisters. And what she manages to do is not only build a network of schools in Toronto, but then those Loretto sisters later spread to the Niagara. They build a convent in Niagara overlooking the falls, which became Teresa Dease's favorite place in Canada to be. They built schools in Stratford, in Hamilton, and eventually spread into the United States. And when you think it all started with this one idea that Power had and the energy of these five women and Teresa Dease to lead them for several decades, impressed so much so that the Governor General of Canada in the late 19th century, Lord Lorne, visited Toronto, and his wife, the princess, was so taken by Teresa Dease, she said, "I didn't expect it, but you are truly an English lady." Teresa Dease allegedly responds, "No, ma'am, I'm from Dublin." And just to give you that sense, she still held on to her Irish identity, but built a network of religious. And I think that's symbolic, Edward, of the way in which these Catholic Church networks spread over the various regions of the country, given the Irish bishops who may have been there or the religious orders that came from Ireland, Sisters of Mercy in Newfoundland, Presentation Sisters, Sisters of Charity, and the like. So that's one story. Second story is 20th century, and it's an Irish Protestant from the north of Ireland. His name was William, but everybody called him Patrick Reed or Paddy Reed. He was a soldier. He was in the armored division, the Northern Irish Horse in Italy, and served with Canadians in Northern Italy during the Second World War. He thought they were the best fighters going in fighting the Nazis, and became enamored with all things Canadian. So much so that at the end of the war, after his tour of duty was over, he was seconded by NATO and then asked for special training in Kingston, Ontario. He eventually went back to Ireland and told his parents that he was going to emigrate officially to Canada, and he did. And he got into the advertising business in Ottawa. In fact, he worked with Crawley Films in Ottawa for a short time doing promotions. And over the course of his career was in British Columbia, and then was called back to Ottawa to head up a very special branch that promoted Canada abroad. Now, here's the irony. Here you have a Northern Irishman who is promoting the country of his adoption, so to speak, abroad with international exhibitions and the like. But his claim to fame in his own writing was in 1964, Canada was debating heavily about having a new flag. Prime Minister Pearson was at his wit's end with the opposition to a flag that wasn't the Canadian ensign or the Union Jack. And George Stanley, a historian, had presented a maple leaf design. Pearson gave that design to Patrick Reed and his French-Canadian designer, Saint-Cyr, and they worked on a flag. Reed said that he wanted the flag, first of all, to be something that school children could draw quite easily in school. That maple leaf in the middle had to be easily drawn. It was standardized. He said this flag, secondly, has to look the same from one side to the other. So when it's flying, you don't know which is the proper side. It's still all proper. And thirdly, that the dye had to be color fast, okay? Because it might turn pink as it weathered. So he got a color fast red. Now, the story goes, Edouard, that Patrick Reed and his team in this civil service niche decided that they would hang the flag on the flagpole at Sussex Drive at night so that when Pearson woke up in the morning, the first thing he saw when he looked out the window was the new flag. Whether the story is true or not, I don't know, but it's a good story. And Pearson liked the flag. And so Patty Reed went on to be our chef de mission at Expo 86, which was his creation, and various other things. He said that the best job in his life was promoting Canada to the world. But every time we put the Canadian flag on our lapel or see it, we should remember that it was a Northern Irishman who helped give that design what it is today. So that's why I love that story. And of course, he's one of the ones who died in the 20 teens. So it kind of brings us from Tag O'Brien in New France to the present. But just a great story. I just love that story. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. And I think it makes us think that in our stories and national story and maybe international story, sometimes the unexpected comes from one person that we did not really expect this to come. Who would expect that Mr. Reed will design Canadian flag? It's something what we should be ready. But in your
Can I just say
reflections,
though on that,
yes,
Edward, just
yes,
you do
yes.
make that point about surprises. The Mounties, such an iconic force and a part of the identity of Canada, was based on the Royal Irish Mounted Constabulary, and this was news to me and news to an awful lot of other people. The iconic Eaton's department store, set up by an Irishman, Timothy Eaton,
Hmm.
who created the catalogue that was received with such excitement in the
Hmm.
in the gloomy autumn months because it was a Christmas catalogue and you could order things. And he did a Christmas Day parade, which was then swiped by Macy's. The kind of founding father of Canadian naturalism, the study of the fauna and flora, John McGowan again. So we just kept finding these people who wielded huge influence and people who were not even known. There was an Irish guy who wrote, thanks to John A. Macdonald's invitation, he wrote most of Canadian jurisprudence. Gowan, James Robert Gowan. It's just everywhere you looked, you could find that there were these people who had helped construct Canada, and as Mark says, even constructing the flag, an icon of Canadian identity that's recognized around the world. So the more we pulled on this string, the more we discovered, you know.
And you
And
know what
also,
I find fascinating.
negatively, someone like Nicholas Flood Davin, who
Oh
was
yeah.
commissioned by John A. Macdonald to go to the United States, and he brought back the blueprint for Indigenous residential schools. So, I mean, with the light, we also have the shadow side
Mhm.
of this book.
You know what I find fascinating that reading this book and looking at these lives, we could be inspired, and I almost about to say we should be inspired ourselves to think, what can I bring to this common place in our society in order to live better together? And you underlined the personal input of these people in the community, in their religious community, in the society in general. And before we close the conversation on three of us, my question to you would be, you underlined it was the people like the bishops, the lords, the people of very humble and modest origin, men and women, but they also were in interaction with the First Nations. What would you say about this very delicate issue that really also we live today, and how these Irish lives can inspire us in our relationship to our story of relationship with the First Nations?
I think the critical point I think that we make in the book, and that is relevant to the issue of the indigenous, is that colonial context. You know, that the Irish are colonized in Ireland quite brutally in many instances, certainly in the 16th and 17th centuries. Um, they have a catastrophic famine visited upon them in the mid 19th century,
Mm,
which, was the failure of a crop, but in a situation created by British direct rule for the previous 40 years. So there's British culpability in a famine that reduces our population from 8 million to 4 million through death, disease, and immigration. So we understood, and Irish do understand, the nature intimately of colonization. And so I think our story and how it transfers across the Atlantic adds a context that I think does help explain the colonization within British North America and its impact on the indigenous people in a way that is often not spoken about. And it's a really interesting reflection, I think, on both Ireland and Canada that having achieved post-colonial status, we don't often talk about it. I mean, throughout my life in Ireland, we never talked about colonialism. We just kind of looked forward. And Canada, in a way, kind of does that. You know, a lot of Canadians rather would say, oh, our history is boring. No, I think if you read our book, it's a fascinating history, a
yeah.
complicated, fascinating history involving global politics because, and we can go into that with, like, for example, the essay on Wellington and how the interaction between the British and the fight with the French was fought in Canada and then later with Germany in the two world wars that Canada came to the assistance of Britain for example. It's a fascinating story. It's not. Some people I sometimes used to joke that people think that Canada was invented by Pierre Trudeau. It kind of popped out of nowhere. No, it's got this deep, fascinating history. But I think the situation of the Indigenous and what happens to them, because it's very dynamic up until about the 1850s in Confederation. It's very much a partnership between Indigenous and settlers, and then after that, it becomes the problem, which, as Marcus rightly pointed out, an Irishman was key to addressing that and creating the Indian residential school system. So we don't shrink back from these critical issues. But I think it's a really interesting dynamic between the Irish and the Indigenous, that there's a great understanding, but equally the Irish are there as part of a major settlement project. And like, for example, I mentioned the Mounties. If you're Indigenous, the Mounties were the cutting edge of colonialism, So yes, it is complicated, but I think it's better to embrace the complexity if you really want to understand the truth.
Amy, several of the biographies do reflect, Pod Mulrooney, who's the final biography in the book, worked in Northern Ontario with Indigenous peoples, was a filmmaker, a photographer, and really recorded their stories and had an exceptionally fine relationship with the First Nations that he worked with. Bridget Moran, again in the Northwest Coast, as a public advocate for Indigenous rights in British Columbia. But one of the striking stories that becomes one of the thematic essays, takes us back to the Irish famine and some of the work that Jason King and I did has recovered, not discovered, but recovered letters that essentially were forgotten, written by Indigenous peoples sending money for Irish famine relief in 1847, and that First Nations, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat in what is now Ontario, and the Abenaki, the Haudenosaunee from Kahnawake near Montreal, and the Huron-Wendat from Ancien Lorette, sent money, sometimes in Quebec through the bishop, the Archbishop Signier of Quebec City, for Irish relief. And the relief monies coming from Indigenous peoples in what is now Ontario amounted to somewhere in the neighborhood of, in current value, about 20,000 Canadian dollars. And these were people who admitted that they grieved for their, as they said, their white brethren under the crown, and wished they could do more, but they were poor and they gave of what they had to people that they would have never met. Although at Curve Lake, which is just north of Peterborough, their letter admits that they've had such good relations with the British around them, but the British around them were actually Irish who had settled there under the auspices of Peter Robinson's settlement 200 years ago in 1825. And when Jason and I visited the reserve at Curve Lake and listened to the stories that elders had, it was about, oh, my granny was from Ennismore, or oh, we love the Irish. They were in the area. We traded with them and the like. And so there's a story of reciprocity that goes back, over time. But I would agree with Eamonn is that the colonizer, in one sense, was a former person who was colonized, and the Irish became very good at the British colonial project, depending on where they were in Canada and what the circumstances were. It is a complicated relationship, and I think one that scholars and others now will have to flesh out as we move into this period of trying to discover the truth so that we can move to a reconciliation in a meaningful way. And I think in some ways this book contributes to that fact finding and to that truth telling about Indigenous Irish relations. I mean, there's far more out there right now. I'm working on another project just on Lord Dufferin, who was a Protestant Irish landlord, Governor General of Canada from 1872 to 1878. And interestingly enough, the Indian Act was given royal assent on his watch, and so were treaties 3 through 7. He had to clean up the aftermath of the Red River insurrection and deal with the politics of Sitting Bull coming to Canada after the Battle of the Little Bighorn. So there's all kinds of stories and all kinds of understanding we still need to explore and to incorporate into the huge narrative, which is Canadian history.
Thank you, Mark. It's fascinating, but now it's the time for the question period. And it's a reminder for and to our participants that you can type your question at any moment using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And we have already a question, it's a comment, but also a question, and it comes from Anne Walsh. Uh, uh, Anne Walsh writes, Mark and Eamonn, I am grateful to you for bringing this Canadian face of Irish immigration to light for us. I particularly appreciate the presentation of these remarkable people as survivors. How would you recommend that we gathered here online continue this unveiling of often unknown stories and make them known? So the question is, how would you recommend that we gathered here online continue this unveiling of often unknown stories and make them known?
I mean, I would say actually look into your own ancestry as much as you can and recover those stories of your own predecessors and the decisions they made and the journeys they undertook and how they ended up settling where they are. That I think is kind of one of the first stops. I mean, I think also myself and Mark have thought about what comes next, and I think there are two parts to that. One. Clearly you could have an online resource where you could add in more profiles as you go, same format. You can also, and we used to do this, sometimes I would do this, if you go on to the Dictionary of Canadian Biography and simply put in an Irish surname, you come up with all kinds of interesting people within that kind of catchment. Um, and then the other project that we've been thinking about as a follow-up to this is 50 Irish places in Canada. That we could again do a profile of a place that had a particular Irish connection. And this goes back to Mark's kind of opening point as well, and what he emphasized to me, which was that the Irish in Canada are a series of communities of communities. And the other point that he impressed on me, because I knew very little about the Irish in Canada when I came first, is that you have to understand that the 100,000 or so Irish immigrants who flee the famine to Canada in 1847, they're coming at the end of a settlement process that has been going on for the preceding 2 or 3 centuries. Whereas a lot of the lore, the imaginative framework of the Irish in Canada is like the Irish in the US. It's all about the famine, and it's actually not. Mass immigration to Canada really drops off after 1847 and switches to the United States. Although you do continue to have incredible influencers coming across to Canada thereafter. So yeah, there's a few ideas. We do need to build to tell more of this story because, like I said at the opening, it's a really unknown story, you know.
Mark,
And
and what would you say?
I don't have much to add to that because I agree. I mean, crassly, I mean, this book would help people get started, okay? Because some of the tools that we've put into this book are we haven't cluttered each of the essays with footnotes. What we've done is we've had further reading at the end, and perhaps a biography would give you a sense of, oh, I could do it that way in exploring my own roots. The other thing is that I've been compiling lists of names that aren't in this book from people who have picked it up and said, "Well, why wasn't, so and so in this book or so and so?" And I thought, well, that's a really good point, and I'll take that down and not to put the publisher's feet to the fire, but who knows, the next volume could actually be 50 plus Irish lives in Canada because I now have about 25 more suggestions that people have made. So, I mean, the book has actually stimulated questions like yours, Anne, to say, okay, who else could be included in this, crossing the whole gamut of Irish migration? Um, I find in your question, you had mentioned survivor, and I think that's an interesting term because I'm not an immigrant, but my wife is, and there is the element in so many different ways defined of surviving leaving your home of so long, leaving family, surviving in a completely new environment. In my wife's case, she came from Liverpool of Irish and Welsh roots, but when she arrived in Thunder Bay, Canada, the games were different. The children spoke differently. They made fun of her accent, and life was, and in a sense, that's a child's way of surviving. But if I look through these biographies, I see that there is survival on very many different levels, whether you were an Irish famine orphan or you were a politician like John Hart trying to adapt to a different political system, which he managed to navigate and become a premier of British Columbia. So I think it's a really important word, survivor, because we survive in so many different ways. With a name like Walsh, I'm almost thinking Newfoundland here, and certainly one of the landmarks of 50 Irish places in Canada would be the Basilica in St. John's, which Eamonn saw for the first time, and then he emailed me and said, "Mark, it's the Irish Taj Mahal of North America." So
Yeah, and Walsh tells us a huge history as well, because Walsh means Welsh. The Welsh
mhm.
came in with Strongbow in 1170 as soldiers into the southeast, Waterford, Wexford. So again, the long arm of the very long arm of history in your surname, man.
And what seems to me, what you underline through this question of Anne Walsh, and she says, if I understood well, Mark, she knows you from the Basilica and St. Michael's. So, and
There we go.
yeah, and what it looks to me, it comes out that the secret of the really being ourselves it's hidden in the memory that we discover and rediscover more and more again and again. And what you are suggesting is to take a look at our family roots, at our interactions of our families with others. And, listening to you, you published the 50 Irish lives in Canada. Maybe someone can explore 50 Scottish lives in Canada. Or I'm thinking about Manitoba, there was big Ukrainian immigration, 50 Ukrainian lives in Canada. In fact, what I found fascinating about your project, from the Irish identity, without denying who Irish were and are in Canada, you're inviting everyone discover or rediscover this particular input in the common good story. So, how would you think about this, and why after this project you conceived the project 50 places, 50 Irish places? Why places?
Again, I think it's because each place tells a particular story of how the Irish arrived and their interaction with the local people and even landscape around them. And I think Mark was making that point earlier. If you're Irish and you arrive in Montreal, it's one experience. If you arrive as Irish in Toronto, where Toronto is dominated by the Orange Order, it's a very different experience. If you arrive in the context of the famine, or if you arrive at Pier 21 in Halifax and take the train west, these are all different experiences. But of course, because there's so many place names and so many places that had concentrated, because this is one of the things about the famine immigration tended to concentrate in the cities. But you already had concentrations of people. We've already mentioned, of course, Newfoundland famously, but Halifax had a huge concentration of Irish there, particularly because of the Irish involvement in the army and so on. So I think it will tell a very kind of uh, it kind of captures the kaleidoscope of different experiences in a way, in a more kind of communal way as well. Um, and you'll see, and it'd be really interesting to look at where those places where you go from, Irish Town in Halifax, Cabbage Town in Toronto, Byward Market in Ottawa, for example, is in the lower swampy part of Bytown, and that's where the Irish collected and where the bars were, and Mother McGinty, another great character we have in the book. So there's that. I think but there's a broader point as well, is that, and we've said this before, it's about being complicated. In a way, the Irish in the United States have a very easy story to tell. One of our contributors and the great historian, David Wilson, said to be a Republican in the US is to go with the grain. To be a Republican in Canada was to go against the grain. And so the Irish in the United States have a very clear story to tell because many of them have come, the majority came with the famine. And so you have this idea of exiles from a catastrophe in Ireland. They go to the United States, they help shape the Republic of the United States, and the US in turn supports the rebels, 1916, and Irish independence. One of the problems with Canada is that Canada was supposed to be our constitutional future. And I used to make this point as an ambassador. Canada was the future Ireland never had. Up until the Easter Rising in 1916, the vast majority of Irish constitutional nationalists, meaning the vast majority of Irish nationalists, whether in Ireland or elsewhere, including in Canada, they simply wanted what Canada had: a dominion and a parliament within a dominion of the British Empire. So, for example, Charles Stewart Parnell in the latter part of the 19th century, he would go to Canada. In the early part of the 20th century, John Redmond, the leader of Irish nationalism, went to Canada. And they would say to the British government, we will be as loyal as Canada if you give us our parliament back. And so our constitutional futures were seen to be ad idem. This was going to happen eventually. And when you look at the language of the treaty in 1921, it talks about Canada being the model. But the 1916 Rising, the execution of the leaders, the vicious war of independence, the vicious response to the War of Independence by the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries and the British forces in general, plus the partition of Ireland, meant that the political objective of Irish nationalism becomes republicanism and no longer Canada. And so, in a way, our affinity with Canada became kind of awkward and set aside. And again, that's why there's this kind of, I think, there's this break where there's a kind of a convergence with the United States and a divergence from Canada, which we're now kind of looping back to converge again with Canada, and makes it very, very interesting. And one of the reasons that's happening as well is because so many of our Irish immigrants in the wake of the global financial crisis, came to Canada and have revived the Irish presence, particularly in Toronto and Vancouver and other places.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, Mark, go.
And place is important, particularly in the rural areas where many of the Irish, unlike the United States, did settle as well. And people leave their mark on place, whether it's in a structure or a cemetery or a school or a shrine. And you could take it from the Basilica in St. John's, Newfoundland, which is really quite an Irish Catholic statement, to Orange Lodge number 27 in Shawville in the Ottawa Valley, which was an Irish Protestant enclave, or Mount St. Patrick in Ontario, where not only do you have an old stone church, but you have an Irish cemetery and you have a holy well, one of the few holy wells I know that is transferred culturally from Ireland to Canada. So place is so very important. And that intersection of people with place, creates just a plethora of story. And I think that's why this next book, if should it come to pass, is sort of pregnant with possibility.
It's very interesting. Thank you, Eamonn. Thank you, Mark. And before I give a few closing remarks about our webinar, what it's also, interesting in your reflection in the book and that you, Eamonn, just brought into light in your reflection, it's a very interesting relationship or interrelationship between uh, uh, independence reflections and the relationship between Irish in Ireland, Irish in the United States, Finn brothers, the Irish in Canada, and all this is very complex story with very different points of view, and I found it's very interesting to discover, and also maybe even to take a look at our actual reflections about independence, federation, in terms of why and how we think these realities in our actual life, grounded and inspired, by people who was living before us. Unfortunately, our session is coming to an end, and to conclude this webinar, I would like to once again thank you, Eamonn, McKee, and you, Mark McGowan, for agreeing to discuss this fascinating topic. If you did not have the chance to ask your questions, feel free to email them to Navalis Publishing, and we will forward them to the speakers on your behalf. A reminder that Navalis is offering 25% off the purchase of 50 Irish Lives in Canada. My colleague will share, and is already shared in the chat box to the right of your screen. It will also be emailed to you next this week, along with the link to the video available on our YouTube channel. You have until April the 2nd, 2026, inclusive, to use the promotion. And lastly, thank you to all participants. I hope you enjoyed this webinar. On behalf of the entire Navalis team, thank you again and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you, Eamonn, and thank you, Mark. It was
Thank you.
Thank
fascinating.
you.
And happy Irish Heritage Month to everybody.
Absolutely. Happy St. Patrick's Day.
Happy St. Patrick's Day. And also we had a request, and I already spoke about this. The recording will be available in a few days.
Great. Thank you, Edward.
Thank you.